It's Show and Tell Saturday, the show in which I tell you about things on a Saturday. And today's item of interest is this. It was sat behind me in a box, and I thought, hey, why not talk about this a little bit? Because it's probably going to be a long time until I actually do a full-on retrospective video on it. So, this is the item. This is a games console, and it's called, you probably can't read it, it's called the Ouya. This thing is infamous. So, first of all, you might be thinking, good golly, that's a tiny games console. And it is. It's about half, maybe even a quarter the size of the GameCube, which itself is a very small console. Yeah, as consoles go, it is possibly, in terms of actual area, it's probably the smallest game console I own. And... well, let me tell you a little story about the Ouya. So this was the first big, I think it was the first big Kickstarter success story, or at the very least the first big video game Kickstarter success story, getting over £1 million, I think, in the end. And the whole point was, it was supposed to be an independently run game console for indie games, essentially. And it was around the time the big indie game boom was happening, 2010. I think it was 2010. So there was clearly a massive market for indie games at the time. But when it released, it just fell flat on its face, because they advertised it as a small Android-based game console, and people were like, oh, that's exciting, and then they got it, and they realised that it was a small Android-based console, and they kind of switched off it almost immediately. So that was one of the problems it had. I do actually have the box as well, just as an aside. Fully boxed thing from friend of the channel, KMT138, thank you very much. Also, great Sorcerer's Apprentice, HR Wizard. That's the controller, so that's the other problem it had. And perhaps the most damning issue is the fact that it was, I think it was about £99, so it was budget for a console at the time when consoles were about £250 to £300. But look at the games. Do they look remarkably like mobile games by any chance? Because guess what? It's an Android thing, and it's spec'd like an Android thing. So this is essentially a phone in a box, which was the real problem it had. And none of the games ran particularly well. And you could probably get better performance out of your phone for the same, well, something you already had that could do better than a console that you'd think would be able to do significantly better. And I know it's only miniature, and I think it's using off-the-shelf components pretty much, but you would have expected better. I think the final sort of nail in the coffin, which is weird for me to say because you'd think that this would be a positive, particularly from the standpoint of, well, from my standpoint, being a big fan of retro games, or vintage games, or classic games, or whatever you call them. This thing was... anybody who used emulators loved this thing. I think this was before the Raspberry Pi was... the Raspberry Pi was available, but it wasn't really all that powerful, and you couldn't do a whole lot with it outside of, like, SNES and before. So this could do like PS1 games. I think it could even do... could it do GameCube games? It might have been able to do GameCube. And I want to say N64 was potentially a thing. Because it was Android, and so there were so many emulators already available for the platform. People just used this in an emulator box, which meant that no revenue was going through the actual Ouya store. Which meant, yeah, it was... for £99 for a console is, you're not making any profit on that. So they were expecting the profit margins to come from the software, which is the case for all game consoles. But then when you've got a console that is meant to be liberated and free, like free as in freedom, and for the players, and as a result, immensely hackable, well, then you've got a bit of a problem. From a business perspective, it was not very well thought out. Massive Kickstarter success, but did not translate into a real-world success. And having a physical one is still quite surprising to me, because I was under the impression that this thing sold so badly that it just didn't... I'm surprised that it even ended up in the shops. I remember this being in the shops. And of course I wasn't interested because, well, why would I be? I wasn't interested in it from the start because I knew that it was just a little Android box. And, you know, I feel like it could have had potential, and maybe it was just a great idea whose time hadn't yet come. Since then, we have had evidence that small indie consoles, perhaps not at the low price point and the budget sort of sensibility that this had, but a small production run, independently owned console running unique games to that system can succeed. Not like this, but there is a system called the Playdate, which is a handheld, and the games for that are all not like 100% unique, but the system is designed in such a way that they have to be made for the system, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like having a Game Boy port of a PS1 game, for example, which did happen. See Oddworld, for example. So it can succeed if there's the right market for it, which there wasn't. Again, it seems weird to say that because there clearly was a market for this because the Kickstarter was so successful, but there wasn't by the time it came out, so I don't really know what happened in the interim. Yeah, it's a strange one, the Ouya, and I would love to do a full-on retrospective of this because it's such a fascinating story. And the fact that I have one, I mean, I did play with it a bit, and I had a friend over and we played with it as well. Obviously didn't work very well because the store has long since shut down. But the games that were on it from the previous owner, I mean, there was a SNES emulator, of course there was, and there were a couple of Ouya games on there. They were crap. They were utter crap. I think one of them didn't even run. So that's very telling. Yeah, I think the software let it down. Anyway, that's Show and Tell Saturday, and that is the Ouya. Despite its misgivings, it is an adorable little thing, isn't it? Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow.